I stepped onto the creaking porch of our Michigan lakeside cabin, with Middle Eastern dust still clinging to my boots. My name is Caleb Miller, a 28-year-old combat engineer returning home after a grueling 14-month deployment that changed everything I knew about loyalty. Instead of a warm welcome, I found my father standing in the doorway, with his arms crossed like a silent stone wall. He didn't offer a hug or even a nod of acknowledgement. Instead, he looked at me with a mixture of pity and contempt that felt sharper than any shrapnel I had encountered overseas. My brother stood right behind him, leaning against the oak frame with a polished smirk that suggested he had already spent the last year rearranging my place in this family. They didn't ask about the missions I led or the nights I spent without sleep, because they had already decided I was a broken man returning from a war I couldn't handle. My father cleared his throat and told the room that I was mentally unstable, claiming my service had left me too volatile to handle the responsibilities of the Miller estate. He spoke about me as if I were a liability rather than a son, using clinical terms to strip away my dignity, while my brother watched with predatory satisfaction. Then my brother leaned in close, his breath smelling of expensive bourbon, as he whispered directly into my ear. "You will always be a failure, Caleb," he said with a chuckle that made my blood run cold. "If you want to see how I dismantled their web of deceit and forced them to face the consequences of their actions, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single chapter of this justice." The heavy silence of the boat shed felt like a sanctuary compared to the suffocating tension inside the main cabin, where Dad and Derek continued their relentless posturing for the high-profile guests. I focused my entire energy on the peeling paint of the old wooden canoe, because working with my hands was the only way to drown out the echoes of my brother's insults. While I was reaching for a fallen wrench near the back of the structure, I noticed that one of the cedar floorboards near the workbench didn't sit flush with the others. Prying the loose wood up revealed a rusted steel fishing tackle box that I recognized as an old heirloom Arthur had supposedly lost years ago during a massive storm on the lake. The heavy padlock snapped open with a single firm strike from my hammer, but the contents inside were far from the lures and fishing lines I had expected to find. Stuffed inside the waterproof lining were 5 pristine envelopes bearing the official seal of the United States Army Command, all addressed to me but never delivered to my hands. My heart hammered against my ribs as I spread the documents across the dusty workbench, realizing they weren't just standard correspondence, but life-altering commands sent from my superiors. The first 2 letters were official notifications of my promotion to captain, a rank I had earned through blood and sweat during the most intense phases of my deployment. The third and fourth documents were citations for the Meritorious Service Medal, recognizing my leadership during the bridge-clearing operations that had saved dozens of soldiers' lives in the sector. However, the final letter was the most devastating because it contained a formal withdrawal of those honors signed with a shaky imitation of my own signature. The forged response claimed that I was declining the promotion and the medals due to persistent post-war mental health struggles and a total lack of psychological stability. Reading those words felt like a second betrayal, because it proved Arthur had weaponized my own sacrifice to label me a failure before I even stepped foot back on American soil. My best friend Sam stepped into the shed just as I was gripping the edge of the workbench to keep my hands from shaking with pure, unadulterated rage. He didn't say a word at first. Instead, he reached down and picked up the citation for the medal while his jaw tightened in visible frustration at the obvious injustice. "Caleb, you need to put those back exactly where you found them and start playing the part they expect of you until we have enough leverage to destroy their narrative," Sam whispered, while looking me straight in the eyes with a grim expression. I realized then that my father hadn't just hidden these letters out of spite, but he had systematically dismantled my career to ensure Derek remained the only successful son in the eyes of the community. Every time Derek bragged about his logistics role, he was essentially standing on the ruins of the career that Arthur had stolen from me behind my back for over a year. I took a deep breath and began folding the papers back into the rusted box, knowing that my calculated silence was now my most powerful weapon against their collective arrogance. The anger that had been smoldering in my chest turned into a cold, hard vow to expose every single lie they had told at my professional expense. Arthur wanted a broken, unstable son to use as a cautionary tale for his friends, but I was going to give him a calculated retribution that he would never see coming until it was too late to repent. I replaced the cedar floorboard and resumed my work on the canoe, making sure that my face was a mask of defeat when I eventually returned to the house to face their mockery. 2 days after finding those letters in the old fishing box, I decided to penetrate the family's private network to see exactly how deep the betrayal ran within these wooden walls. My technical training as a combat engineer had provided me with the patience and the surgical precision needed to bypass the basic security measures that Arthur had mistakenly thought were impenetrable for a man he considered broken. I sat in the absolute darkness of my bedroom with only the pale blue glow of the monitor reflecting in my eyes, while I accessed the administrative console of our home router to examine every single outbound connection record. It did not take long to find exactly what I was looking for, because the traffic logs clearly showed consistent daily access to the secure military portal from the specific IP address assigned to my father's personal desktop computer. While I was carefully analyzing the digital timestamps, I realized that these unauthorized logins occurred at times when I was either deep in sleep or working out in the boat shed, which proved that someone was actively monitoring my official status without my consent. I managed to gain remote access to the local storage of Arthur's machine and discovered a hidden folder containing dozens of unsent draft emails written in my name and addressed to the regional command office. The language used in these documents was intentionally crafted to make me appear like a dangerous liability to the service, frequently utilizing clinical phrases like uncontrolled behavior and a total inability to reintegrate into civilian society. It was absolutely sickening to read my father's careful choice of words as he fabricated a detailed narrative of my mental decline just to ensure I would be forced into an early discharge. "Caleb, just sit there and watch your brother rise. At least this family's reputation can still be saved." "Thanks to Derek," my father called out from the living room with a voice full of smug pride that made my skin crawl. I also heard Derek laughing as he replied that I was too far gone to even understand what real success looked like anymore, which only hardened my resolve to finish the digital audit of their treachery. I stayed silent while my jaw tightened, because I knew that Derek had played a crucial role in this operation by stealing the 2-factor authentication codes from my phone during the brief moments I left it unattended for even a second. Without those sensitive codes, they never would have been able to bypass the military-grade security layers of my account, which meant my own brother had been pickpocketing my digital life while pretending to care about me. My mother, Martha Miller, walked past my door. At that moment, her footsteps hesitating for a split second before she continued down the hallway without saying a word, leaving me alone in the shadows of my room. I continued my search through the system archives and eventually stumbled upon a high-resolution PDF file that made my blood run cold with its professional medical letterhead and cold clinical diagnosis of my character. The document was a comprehensive psychological evaluation signed by a local private physician whom Arthur had apparently bribed with thousands of dollars to state that I was suffering from chronic and violent instability. This was clearly the final piece of their treacherous strategy to strip away my legal autonomy and take control of the lakeside property that grandfather Silas had intended for me to manage alone. I carefully began transferring every network log, every malicious draft, and the forged medical report onto a secure encrypted drive hidden inside my tactical gear for the upcoming legal confrontation that was now inevitable. Knowing that they were actively plotting to have me committed to a psychiatric facility just so they could sell the land under my feet gave me a clarity of purpose that outweighed any sense of family loyalty. My father and Derek believed they were playing a high-stakes game against a weak pawn, but they failed to realize that I was a specialist, trained to identify and neutralize hidden threats before they detonated under our feet. I closed the laptop and sat in the heavy shadows of the lakeside cabin, feeling the weight of the encrypted drive in my hand as the first real step toward reclaiming my future from their lies and deceitful actions. 3 days later, the sound of whispered arguments from my father's office caught my attention in the middle of the night when the rest of the house was supposed to be completely silent. I moved cautiously down the narrow hallway while pressing my back against the cold wood of the wall to avoid being detected by the flickering light coming from under the heavy office door. Inside the room, Arthur and Derek were huddled over a series of architectural drawings and legal documents that I recognized as the official land survey of the lakeside property belonging to my grandfather, Silas Miller. They were speaking in hushed, urgent tones with a representative from a massive real estate development corporation about the potential sale of the entire shoreline for a multi-million-dollar luxury resort project. Since this valuable land had been specifically bequeathed to me in the original will of Silas Arthur, was outlining a calculated plan to utilize those forged medical documents we had discovered earlier to declare me legally incompetent. By establishing a permanent guardianship over my private affairs due to my supposed mental instability, they would be able to bypass my signature and finalize the massive transaction without any legal interference from the rightful owner. This contract is worth more than $2 million, and as long as Caleb is labeled as unstable, it will belong to us. Derek said excitedly over the phone while gesturing toward the profit margins spread out on the desk. My father nodded in agreement, adding that the future wealth of the Miller family depended on ensuring that my military record remained stained by the allegations of psychological trauma they had worked so hard to fabricate. I stood there in the darkness, feeling a cold shiver of realization that they were not just stealing my hard-earned career honors, but were actively trying to erase my legal existence for the sake of a payout, just as I was about to retreat back to my bedroom to avoid being caught. My mother, Martha Miller, appeared from the kitchen with a glass of water and stopped dead in her tracks when our eyes met in the dim light. She looked at me for a long, agonizing moment before she bowed her head in a gesture of profound guilt and hurried away into the shadows of the master bedroom without saying a single word of comfort. Witnessing her silent retreat felt like a heavy blow to my chest because I realized that her complicity was just as terrifying as the active malice displayed by Arthur and Derek in the other room. She had chosen to look the other way, while her own husband and eldest son plotted to have me committed to a psychiatric facility for a piece of land that she knew belonged to me. The isolation of the lakeside cabin suddenly felt much more dangerous than any hostile territory I had ever crossed, because the real enemies were sleeping just a few yards away from my own bed. I waited until the office light finally went out, and the house settled back into a deceptive peace, before I quietly returned to my room to initiate my own counterintelligence operation against their greed. I used an encrypted messaging app to contact Grant Sterling, a respected attorney who had been a close confidant of Silas for over 30 years, to arrange an urgent meeting regarding the suspicious changes being made to our family estate. While waiting for his response, I carefully organized the digital files I had collected, ensuring that the evidence of their financial greed was as clear as the evidence of their military fraud. I need you to verify the primary deed and the specific protection clauses that Silas mentioned before he was moved to the care facility, I typed into the secure chat, while my hands remained steady despite the overwhelming sense of betrayal. I knew that I had to act with extreme caution because one wrong move would allow them to execute their plan of institutionalization before I could present my findings to the proper authorities. The realization that my own father viewed my life as nothing more than a barrier to a bank deposit changed the way I viewed every childhood memory I had of this house. I sat by the window and watched the moonlight ripple across the surface of the lake, knowing that the next few days would determine whether I reclaimed my inheritance or lost my freedom to their calculated deception. My grandfather had always said that integrity was the only currency that truly mattered in the end, and I was determined to prove that his trust in me was not misplaced, despite the surrounding lies. By the end of that week, the lakeside house, which was usually deserted, suddenly became crowded with elite guests and local military officers who had traveled from the nearby base to celebrate another fabrication of the Miller family. Arthur had spent thousands of dollars organizing a grand reception to honor what he called the exceptional career achievements of Derek, although I knew every word out of his mouth was a calculated lie. The reality was that Derek had spent the last several months plagiarizing my old strategic intelligence reports from our shared server and presenting them as his own original work to impress the regional command. To further cement my status as the family's failure, my father had ordered me to act as a server for the night, forcing me to carry heavy trays of expensive champagne to the very people who should have been saluting my own rank. I moved through the crowd, with a tray balanced on my hand, listening to Arthur describe my supposed mental decline to a group of influential donors, while Derek stood nearby basking in the stolen sunlight of my hard work. My jaw remained tight as I poured drinks for men who had no idea they were talking to the actual author of the tactical assessments they were currently praising with such enthusiasm. As the evening progressed and the guests became distracted by the loud music and the expensive wine, I noticed Arthur and Derek slipping away toward the back balcony that overlooked the dark, rippling waters of Lake Michigan. I recognized a perfect opportunity to strike back and moved toward them with a final bottle of bourbon, carefully hiding a high-sensitivity micro-recorder that I had prepared earlier inside the lining of a clean serving towel. When I approached them under the pretext of refreshing their glasses, I managed to deftly slide the tiny device into the deep pocket of Derek's dress uniform jacket, while they were too busy congratulating each other to notice my presence. I stepped back just enough to remain in the shadows of the sliding glass door, where I could hear every word of their unfiltered arrogance echoing against the quiet of the night. "You will never win this fight, Caleb, because everyone in this county already believes that you are a broken man who needs to be under permanent guardianship," Derek said, while laughing loudly at my supposed helplessness. My father added a low, growling chuckle, swirling his drink and staring out at the lake as if he already owned every inch of the horizon that Grandfather Silas had protected, specifically for me. The best thing I ever did for this family was making sure those 5 letters from command never saw the light of day before they were turned into confetti in my shredder. Arthur admitted with a chilling lack of remorse that made my blood run cold. They continued to discuss how they had successfully drained over $50,000 from my military savings account to cover the massive gambling debts that Derek had accumulated during his last training cycle in Nevada. It became clear that they weren't just trying to hide my success, but they were actively cannibalizing my life to prevent the Miller name from being tarnished by Derek's repeated financial failures and professional incompetence. Every dollar I had earned while dodging shrapnel in a combat zone had been used to buy the very champagne that was now being served to the guests who believed I was a burden on the family. I stood perfectly still in the darkness, feeling the cold air from the lake on my face, while the micro-recorder captured every incriminating detail of their federal fraud and estate manipulation. My mother, Martha, looked out through the glass for a moment, with a pained expression on her face, but she once again turned her back on the truth to avoid disrupting the expensive charade her husband had created. I didn't feel the sting of their insults anymore, because I knew that the recording currently sitting in Derek's pocket was the final nail in the coffin they had tried to build for me. I eventually walked back into the kitchen to resume my duties, moving with the quiet precision of a soldier who had just successfully planted a charge under the enemy's main fortification and was simply waiting for the right moment to pull the trigger on their entire world. The next morning, I was already at the office of lawyer Grant Sterling in downtown Muskegon, with all the evidence in my hands, before the first light of dawn had even touched the surface of the lake. I sat across from the man who had been the closest friend of my grandfather Silas Miller for over 30 years, and watched as he methodically reviewed the 5 hidden letters and the incriminating recording from the balcony. Sterling adjusted his glasses and leaned forward, while his expression shifted from professional curiosity to a deep and visible sense of outrage at the level of deception he was witnessing in the documents. He confirmed that the act of intercepting official military correspondence and forging a service member's signature to decline a promotion was a severe federal offense that carried heavy prison time under the current statutes. After listening to the audio file where Arthur and Derek openly discussed their financial exploitation of my deployment pay, Sterling pulled a thick, leather-bound folder from his private safe with a grim look on his face. He explained that Silas Miller had been a man of immense foresight, who understood the dark undercurrents of greed that often plagued the Miller family line during times of great transition. The lawyer revealed that there was a specific anti-betrayal clause embedded deep within the language of the original will, which was specifically designed to protect the integrity of the estate from any form of internal fraud. Your father and brother have not only violated civil law, but also committed criminal offenses by impersonating a military officer, Caleb Sterling remarked, while looking at me with a gaze that was both sympathetic and intensely serious about the legal battle ahead. He explained that any party found guilty of attempting to coerce or manipulate the legal standing of the primary beneficiary would immediately forfeit their own claims to the inheritance and become liable for all punitive damages. I didn't feel a sense of joy at this news, but rather a cold and clinical satisfaction that the protective system my grandfather built was finally going to function exactly as it was intended to protect his rightful heir. Please ensure that every single transaction they made using my forged signature is documented and flagged for the upcoming court proceedings, I told Sterling, while handing him the final stack of bank statements for his review. I instructed him to immediately begin the preparation for a comprehensive civil lawsuit against both Arthur and Derek to reclaim every dollar they had stolen from my accounts and the valuable lakeside property they tried to sell behind my back. At the same time, I used a secure terminal in his office to upload the entire encrypted drive of digital evidence directly to the personal office of General Raymond Vance at the Regional Command Center for an immediate military review. I spent the remainder of the afternoon writing a meticulous 14-page report that detailed every single day of my 14-month deployment and the systematic way my 5 promotion letters had been intercepted. I described how the strategic intelligence I had gathered on the front lines was being used as a prop for my brother's fake success, while I was being treated like a broken man in my own home. General Vance needs to see the correlation between my deployment schedule and these unauthorized logins, so there is no doubt about the intentional fraud, I explained as I hit the send button on the finalized report. Every sentence I wrote was backed by the timestamps and the precise IP logs that proved my father had used my identity to sabotage my career while I was risking my life for the country. Once the digital submission was confirmed as received by the Military Justice Department, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over my shoulders for the first time since my return to Michigan. I knew that the powerful gears of both the civilian and military justice systems were now turning against the 2 men who believed they were untouchable behind their masks of family loyalty. I drove back to the lakeside cabin during the late evening, watching the long shadows of the trees stretch across the road, while I mentally prepared myself for the final act of this long charade. I walked through the front door and maintained a perfectly neutral expression, greeting Arthur and Derek as if I was still the broken and defeated son they expected me to be in their presence. They were sitting at the kitchen table discussing more plans for the land sale, completely unaware that the legal foundation of their entire world had already been dismantled by my actions during the day. I went straight to my room and began packing my tactical gear, knowing that I would soon be leaving this house for good, and that I would never have to look at their deceitful faces ever again once the truth was officially revealed. At exactly 8 o'clock on the morning of the regional recognition ceremony, I put on my most pristine and sharp dress uniform before walking into the grand hall of the academy with a steady heart and a clear mind. The air inside the auditorium was thick with the scent of floor wax and the hushed expectations of high-ranking officers who had gathered to witness the presentation of the year's highest military honors. Derek Miller was already standing on the elevated stage with a self-absorbed grin that suggested he truly believed he was the primary architect of the strategic success being celebrated by the community. My father sat in the very first row next to several local dignitaries, leaning forward with an expression of intense pride that was entirely built upon the systematic destruction of my own professional reputation. I remained at the back of the room for a moment, watching as the presenter began to recount a list of accomplishments that I had achieved while enduring the harsh conditions of the combat zone. Every word spoken about Derek's supposed leadership felt like a physical weight on my shoulders, because I knew those achievements were stolen directly from my intercepted reports and 5 hidden letters of commendation. The atmosphere shifted instantly when General Raymond Vance walked onto the stage and signaled for the master of ceremonies to step away from the microphone with a gesture of undeniable authority. The room fell into a profound and heavy silence as the general adjusted the podium and looked out at the audience with an expression of cold, professional disapproval that made everyone sit upright. He announced that he was halting the current proceedings to address a matter of severe administrative fraud and unauthorized interference that had recently been discovered within the regional command logs. My father and Derek looked at each other with a sudden flicker of confusion that quickly began to transform into a visible sense of growing panic as they realized the script was changing. The massive projection screens behind the stage suddenly flickered to life, displaying the undeniable evidence of the forged emails and the unauthorized IP access logs that I had meticulously collected from our home network. The audience gasped in collective shock as a high-resolution image of the forged signature on my promotion decline letter was broadcast for every high-ranking officer in the room to analyze for themselves. Then the crystal-clear audio recording of Arthur's confession from the balcony filled the hall, making his chilling admission of shredding my 5 promotion letters echo against the vaulted ceilings of the prestigious academy. The absolute silence that followed was devastating because everyone in the room realized they were witnessing a calculated act of institutional sabotage rather than a simple administrative error by a distant office. These letters were never lost. They were stolen by the very people sitting here. General Vance shouted over the growing murmurs of the stunned crowd while pointing directly toward my father and Derek. My father and brother turned a ghostly shade of pale as they realized that their entire web of deception was collapsing under the weight of the digital and physical evidence being presented. Arthur gripped the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white, but he found himself unable to move or speak as the weight of the public exposure crushed his arrogance. Derek stepped back from the microphone with a look of pure terror, realizing that the medal he had coveted was now a symbol of his own impending professional and personal downfall. "Captain Caleb Miller, please come forward to reclaim the honors and the rank that have been wrongfully withheld from you," General Vance announced, while looking directly toward the back of the hall where I was standing. I began the long walk down the center aisle, moving with the disciplined posture of a soldier who had nothing to hide and everything to reclaim after over a year of silence and betrayal. As I passed the first row, I didn't even glance at my father or Derek, instead focusing my eyes entirely on the general, who was waiting to restore the integrity of my military record. Military police units suddenly appeared at every entrance of the hall to block any possible escape for my father and brother, while the audience erupted into a firm and respectful applause. I ascended the stairs to the stage and stood before General Vance, feeling the immense relief of finally being seen as the officer I truly was, rather than the failure my family had tried to create. I stood at attention while the general saluted me, acknowledging my service and the strength it took to fight a silent war against the very people who were supposed to protect my future. 4 weeks after the legal storm finally passed, I stood on the weathered porch of the lakeside cabin and looked out at the calm, glassy surface of the water, which reflected a sense of peace I had not experienced since before my deployment. The legal consequences for Arthur and Derek Miller had been devastatingly thorough, leaving them with absolutely nothing but the wreckage of the reputations they had spent years trying to polish through systematic lies and deception. Derek was officially handed a dishonorable discharge from the United States Army and sentenced to a significant term in federal prison for multiple counts of aggravated identity theft and the forgery of sensitive military documents that had originally belonged to me. My father was successfully prosecuted for massive financial fraud and the deliberate embezzlement of my combat pay and survivor benefits, resulting in the total seizure of his personal assets to repay the debts he had accumulated behind my back for over a year. They both ended up completely penniless and stripped of every ounce of honor they had tried to steal from my career while I was risking my life on foreign soil for the sake of this country. I officially took full legal possession of the valuable lakeside property that Grandfather Silas had intended for me to manage, but I made the calculated decision to sell the entire tract to a prominent nature conservation organization that promised to keep the land pristine. This choice ensured that the beautiful shoreline would be protected from the greedy reach of developers forever, which I knew was the only outcome that would have truly made Silas proud of his legacy and the strength of his heir. The house that had once felt like a prison of silence was now empty and hollow in a different way, allowing me to finally breathe without the constant pressure of their judgment or the fear of their next manipulation. I walked through each room one last time to ensure that no trace of my former life remained before locking the door and handing the keys over to the new trustees of the conservation group. Martha Miller arrived at the cabin during my final afternoon there to beg for a chance at reconciliation. But I found that my heart was completely closed to the idea of allowing her back into my life after her years of complicity. I told her that while I did not hold on to active hatred or a desire for revenge, I could never trust someone who watched my future be dismantled and chose to say nothing until the truth was finally forced into the light. I watched her drive away through the rearview mirror as I left Michigan for good heading toward a new military assignment in a different state where I would serve with the rank and respect I had rightfully earned through my own dedication. I felt a profound sense of lightness as I crossed the state line carrying only the lessons of my survival and the unwavering belief that truth is the only foundation worth building upon when you are creating a new future. Before we conclude today's intense journey, please do not go just yet, because there are some profound lessons we must extract from the trials that Caleb Miller endured during his fight for justice. This story serves as a powerful and stark reminder that shared blood should never be used as a convenient excuse to tolerate systematic abuse or the professional sabotage of your own hard-earned future. We must understand that true integrity does not need to shout to be heard, but it absolutely requires a solid foundation of documented facts and unwavering personal boundaries to survive against calculated manipulation from those closest to you. If you were in Caleb's difficult position, Would you have chosen to completely cut ties with your mother for her silence, or would you have attempted to find some middle ground for the sake of the family name? Please share your honest thoughts and personal perspectives in the comments section below, because your experiences with boundaries and accountability can provide immense support to others who might be facing similar betrayals. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this story, and I truly appreciate your continued support and engagement as we explore these complex themes of character and personal strength together.